Detective Inspector James Thompson had worked hard his entire life, growing up in a small council flat in Birmingham. He studied every night by candlelight when the electricity was cut off. His mother, Mary, cleaned offices to pay for his books. She would come home with tired hands and aching feet, but she always asked about his studies first. "Education is your way out, son," she would whisper while counting coins for his school supplies. James remembered those nights clearly, while other children played outside. He sat at their small kitchen table with his textbooks spread around him. The candle flame danced as he read about law and justice. He dreamed of a day when he could make things fair for people like his mother, people who worked so hard but were often ignored or treated poorly. Years passed like pages in a book. James studied harder than anyone else at university. He worked part-time jobs to help his mother pay rent. Some days he was so tired he could barely keep his eyes open during lectures. But he never gave up. His professors noticed his dedication. His classmates respected his quiet determination. After graduation, James joined the police force. He walked the streets of Manchester with pride, knowing he was making his mother's sacrifices worth something. He treated everyone with respect, whether they were rich or poor, black or white. His colleagues sometimes laughed at his kindness, but James remembered his mother's words about treating others the way you want to be treated. The years moved quickly. James solved difficult cases and helped many people. His superiors noticed his fair judgment and clear thinking. When the opportunity came to become a judge, James felt his mother's proud smile even though she had passed away 2 years earlier. At 42, he was one of the youngest judges in Manchester, but his heart carried the wisdom of someone who had seen both struggle and success. On this cold Tuesday morning in November, James woke up early as he always did. He put on his best navy blue suit, the one he had bought to celebrate his appointment as judge. He picked up his worn leather briefcase, the same one his father had carried to his factory job every day before he died when James was 12. Inside the briefcase were important court documents and a small photo of his parents on their wedding day. The Manchester Crown Court building stood tall and impressive against the grey morning sky. James had walked through these doors many times as a lawyer, but today felt different. Today, he would preside over his first major case as a judge. He felt nervous but excited, knowing that he could help people find justice. The courtroom was already busy when James arrived. People sat on wooden benches, some looking worried, others talking quietly with their lawyers. Court clerks moved around with stacks of papers. The morning light came through tall windows, making everything look formal and important. Near the main entrance stood Police Constable Emily Clark. She had been working at the court for 8 years, but something had hardened in her heart over time. She had grown up in a small town where people who looked different were rare. Her father had filled her head with old ideas about who belonged where and who could be trusted. Even though she worked in a place where justice was supposed to be blind, Emily still saw the world through the narrow lens of prejudice. When Emily saw James walking toward the courtroom, she did not see a successful man who had worked hard for everything he achieved. She did not see someone's son who had studied by candlelight and honored his mother's sacrifices. She did not see a judge who had spent years fighting for fairness and justice. She saw only the color of his skin, and her mind immediately jumped to the worst conclusions. "Excuse me," Emily said in a rude voice, stepping directly into James's path. Her tone was sharp and unfriendly. "Defendants sit over there." She pointed with her finger toward the wooden benches on the left side of the room, where people accused of crimes waited for their cases to be heard. James stopped walking and looked at her calmly. He had faced this kind of treatment before in his life. But it still surprised him to encounter it in a place dedicated to justice. His voice was gentle and patient when he spoke. "I think there's been a mistake, officer." "No mistake," Emily replied, raising her voice so that other people in the courtroom could hear her. "You people always try to sit where you don't belong. Move along now." Her words were like sharp stones thrown at James's dignity. Other people in the courtroom began to turn their heads and stare. Some looked confused. Others seemed uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. James felt the familiar sting of prejudice pierce his heart, but he had learned long ago to keep his composure in difficult situations. His voice remained gentle and respectful. "If you would just listen. I don't need to listen to anything." Emily interrupted him harshly. "Sit down or I'll have you removed from this building." James nodded quietly, his face showing no anger despite the hurt he felt inside. He walked over to the defendant's bench and took a seat, his heart heavy but his spirit unbroken. He had faced this kind of treatment before throughout his life, but it never stopped hurting. Each incident reminded him of how far society still had to go to achieve true equality and justice for all people. As the morning continued, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew more uncomfortable. James sat quietly on the defendant's bench, trying to maintain his dignity while other people stared at him with curious and sometimes sympathetic eyes. He opened his worn leather briefcase and carefully took out some important legal documents that he needed to review before the court session began. The papers were neatly organized in manila folders, each one marked with official court stamps and legal seals. These documents contained case summaries, legal precedents, and judicial notes that James had prepared over the weekend. He had spent hours at his home study, reading through each case carefully and making thoughtful notes in the margins. This was his way of ensuring that every person who came before his court would receive fair and thorough consideration. Emily Clark watched from across the room with growing suspicion. In her narrow mind, she could not imagine how someone like James could possess such official-looking documents. Her prejudices told her that people who looked like him did not belong in professional settings, and certainly did not handle important legal papers. Instead of questioning her own assumptions, she decided to investigate what she saw as suspicious behavior. She walked over to where James sat, her heavy boots making loud sounds on the marble floor. Other people in the courtroom noticed her approach, and conversations began to quiet down as they sensed something uncomfortable was about to happen. Emily stopped directly in front of James, towering over him as he sat on the bench. "What are you doing with those documents?" she demanded in a voice that carried across the quiet courtroom. Her tone was accusatory and hostile. "Did you steal them?" James looked up at her with eyes that showed both patience and weariness. He had encountered this kind of suspicion many times throughout his career, but it never became easier to handle. He knew that responding with anger would only make the situation worse. So he kept his voice calm and respectful. "These are my papers, officer," he said quietly. "I have every right to be here." Emily let out a harsh laugh that echoed off the high ceiling of the courtroom. The sound was cruel and mocking, designed to humiliate James in front of everyone present. She shook her head as if she had just heard the most ridiculous thing in the world. "Your papers," she said loudly, making sure her voice carried to every corner of the room. "People like you don't have papers like that. You're probably not even supposed to be in this building." Behind the main desk, an elderly clerk named Robert watched the scene unfold with growing concern. Robert had worked in this courthouse for 30 years, starting as a young assistant and working his way up to senior clerk in all his decades of service. He had never witnessed such blatant discrimination and unprofessional behavior from a police officer. His weathered hands gripped the edge of his desk as he struggled with whether to intervene. Robert had seen many changes in the courthouse over the years. He had watched as the legal profession slowly became more diverse, welcoming people from different backgrounds and ethnicities. He had always believed that the courthouse was a sacred place where justice was supposed to be, blind to color, class, and background. What he was witnessing now went against everything he believed the justice system should represent. Other police officers who were stationed around the courtroom began to notice the commotion. They exchanged uncomfortable glances with each other, recognizing that their colleague was behaving inappropriately. However, none of them found the courage to speak up or intervene. Some looked away, pretending not to see what was happening. Others shifted nervously, but remained silent, unwilling to challenge a fellow officer even when they knew she was wrong. James felt the weight of their stares and the burden of their silence. He understood that speaking up for him might put their own positions at risk, but their inaction still hurt. He had spent his entire career trying to create a more just world, and moments like this reminded him how much work still needed to be done. "Officer Clark," James said softly, his voice carrying a dignity that contrasted sharply with her harsh tone. "I understand you're doing your job, but you're making a mistake." Emily's face grew red with anger at what she perceived as defiance. She was not used to having her authority questioned, especially by someone she considered beneath her station. Her voice became even louder and more aggressive as she responded. "The only mistake," Emily said, raising her voice so everyone in the courtroom could hear her clearly, "is letting you in here in the first place. This is a respectable court, not some street corner." The words hit James like physical blows. He felt his face grow warm with embarrassment as dozens of eyes watched the humiliating scene. The shame was not for himself, but for the institution he served and for the people who witnessed such injustice in a place dedicated to fairness. Yet even in this moment of public humiliation, he remembered his mother's gentle but firm words from years ago. "Son," Mary had told him during one of their late-night conversations when he was struggling with discrimination at university, "how you respond to hatred shows who you really are. Anyone can be kind when others are kind to them. The measure of a person is how they act when faced with cruelty and ignorance." Near the back of the courtroom, a young lawyer named William watched the entire scene with growing shock and disbelief. William had recently graduated from law school and was appearing in court for only his third case. He had studied constitutional law and civil rights, but seeing discrimination happen so blatantly in real life was different from reading about it in textbooks. His hands trembled as he watched James endure such treatment with remarkable grace and composure. The tension in the room grew thicker with each passing moment. The large clock on the courtroom wall showed exactly 10 o'clock when Robert, the elderly clerk, pushed back his chair and stood up behind his wooden desk. His movements were slow and deliberate, as they had been for 30 years of faithful service to the court. The morning light streaming through the tall windows caught the silver in his hair as he straightened his shoulders and prepared to perform one of his most important daily duties. Robert cleared his throat and looked round the crowded courtroom. People were still talking quietly among themselves, unaware that everything was about to change. Lawyers shuffled through their papers, defendants sat nervously on benches, and family members whispered words of encouragement to their loved ones. The atmosphere was tense from the earlier confrontation between Emily and James, but no one expected what was about to happen or rise. Robert announced in a voice that had called countless court sessions to order over the decades. His words echoed off the high ceiling and marble walls of the grand courtroom. "All rise for the Honorable Judge James Thompson." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every rustling paper became still. The entire courtroom fell into a silence so complete that people could hear their own heartbeats. It was as if time itself had frozen in that moment of revelation. Every person in the room turned their head to look in the same direction. Their eyes moved toward the defendant's bench where James had been sitting quietly, enduring Emily's cruel treatment with remarkable patience and dignity. For a moment, nobody moved. The shock was too great for immediate understanding. James slowly stood up from the wooden bench where Emily had forced him to sit. His movements were calm and measured, showing no trace of anger or triumph despite everything he had endured that morning. He brushed a small piece of lint from his navy blue suit and straightened his tie with the same careful attention he had learned from his mother years ago. Emily's face drained of all color, becoming as white as fresh paper. Her confident expression melted away like snow in spring sunshine, replaced by a look of absolute horror and disbelief. Her mouth fell open, but no words came out. She tried to speak, tried to say something, anything. But her voice had completely disappeared. Her mind struggled to process what was happening, unable to accept the reality of her terrible mistake. The leather briefcase that Emily had questioned now seemed to glow with new meaning. Those official documents she had accused James of stealing were his own judicial notes and case files. The professional manner she had mocked was the natural bearing of someone who had spent years earning respect through hard work and fair judgment. James began walking calmly toward the front of the courtroom. Each footstep echoed in the deadly quiet room like a drum beat marking time. His worn leather shoes, polished that morning with care, clicked softly against the marble floor. People watched in amazement as the man who had been treated like a criminal just moments before moved with the quiet confidence of someone completely at peace with himself. The judge's bench stood elevated at the front of the courtroom, symbolizing the high position of justice in society. 3 wooden steps led up to the bench, and James climbed them with grace and dignity. He did not hurry or show any sign of the humiliation he had just experienced. His back was straight, his head held high, carrying himself with the bearing of someone who had overcome many challenges in life. When James reached the top of the steps, he turned to face the courtroom. From this elevated position, he could see everyone clearly. The shocked faces, the dropped jaws, the wide eyes of people trying to understand what they had just witnessed. He took a moment to settle into the large leather chair behind the bench, the same chair where countless judges before him had made important decisions about justice and fairness. "You may be seated," James said in a voice that was both kind and strong. His tone carried no anger or bitterness, despite everything that had happened. Instead, it held the warm authority of someone who understood that true power comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. The people in the courtroom slowly took their seats, but their eyes remained fixed on the unfolding drama. Many were still trying to process what they had witnessed. Some felt ashamed for not speaking up earlier. Others felt inspired by James's incredible grace under pressure. Emily remained standing, frozen in place like a statue. Her hands shook uncontrollably as the full weight of her actions crashed down upon her. She realized that she had just insulted, embarrassed, and publicly humiliated the very judge she was supposed to serve and protect. Her career, her reputation. Everything she had worked for over 8 years of police service was now hanging by a thread. The badges on her uniform suddenly felt heavy with shame. The oath she had taken to serve and protect all people equally now seemed like empty words. She had let her prejudices blind her to the truth, and now she faced the consequences of her actions. The other police officers in the courtroom looked down at the ground. Unable to meet anyone's eyes, they felt deep shame for their silence when they should have spoken up. Their failure to intervene made them partners in Emily's disgraceful behavior. William, the young lawyer, felt tears forming in his eyes as he fully understood the magnitude of what had happened. He had just witnessed both the worst and best of humanity in the same morning, the ugliness of prejudice and the beauty of dignity in the face of injustice. Robert, the old clerk, slowly shook his head from side to side. In 30 years of court service, he had never seen anything like this. James looked down at Emily with eyes that held both sadness and understanding. He had encountered fear and prejudice many times throughout his life, but never in his own courtroom. "Officer Clark," James said gently, his voice carrying no hint of revenge or cruelty, "please step forward." Emily's legs felt like water, barely able to support her weight, but she somehow managed to walk slowly toward the judge's bench. James looked down from his elevated position at Emily, who stood trembling before the judge's bench like a leaf shaking in a strong wind. Her police uniform, which she had worn with pride that morning, now felt like a heavy burden on her shoulders. The brass buttons and official patches seemed to mock her unprofessional behavior. Her hands continued to shake uncontrollably, and beads of sweat formed on her forehead despite the cool morning air in the courtroom. The entire courtroom waited in breathless silence to see what would happen next. Lawyers leaned forward in their seats, court staff held their breath, and family members in the gallery watched with wide eyes. Everyone expected to witness an explosion of righteous anger. They anticipated harsh words of condemnation, immediate punishment, and swift revenge for the humiliation Emily had inflicted upon the judge. Some people in the room had their phones ready, thinking they might witness a dramatic confrontation that would make headlines in tomorrow's newspapers. Others whispered quietly among themselves, predicting that Emily's career was over, that she would be publicly destroyed for her terrible behavior. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like a storm was about to break. Instead of anger or harsh words, James spoke with a voice that carried quiet strength and unexpected gentleness. His tone was measured and thoughtful, like a teacher addressing a student who had made a serious mistake but still deserved compassion and understanding. "Officer Clark," James began, his words echoing softly in the silent courtroom, "today you have taught everyone in this room a very important lesson. You have shown us all how quickly and easily we can judge others based on nothing more than the color of their skin." Emily's eyes immediately filled with tears that she tried desperately to hold back. The salt water blurred her vision as she struggled to maintain some semblance of composure. She wanted nothing more than to run away from this courtroom, to disappear from this moment of shame and never face the consequences of her actions. But something deep inside her knew that running away would solve nothing. She had to stand there and face what she had done, no matter how painful it might be. "When I was a boy growing up in Birmingham," James continued, his voice growing softer as he shared personal memories that few people had ever heard, "my mother worked 3 different jobs just to keep food on our table and a roof over our heads. She cleaned office buildings at night, served food in a cafeteria during the day, and took in laundry on weekends." The courtroom remained absolutely silent as James spoke. People could hear the gentle hum of the air conditioning system and the distant sound of traffic outside the tall windows. Even the lawyers had stopped shuffling their papers, completely absorbed in the judge's unexpected response to such cruel treatment. "Every single day," James said, his voice carrying the weight of painful memories, "my mother faced people exactly like you, Officer Clark. People who looked at her tired clothes and dark skin and saw only what they feared, not who she really was inside. They didn't see a woman who read bedtime stories to her son every night, even when she was exhausted. They didn't see someone who saved every penny to buy school supplies and dreamed of a better future for her child." Emily felt her heart breaking as she listened to these words. For the first time in her life, she was truly seeing the human being behind the skin color that had triggered her prejudices. She was understanding that her actions had not just hurt James, but had echoed the pain that countless people had experienced throughout history. The courtroom remained so quiet that people could hear each other breathing, the usual sounds of a busy courthouse, phone ringing, papers rustling, conversations in the hallway, all seemed to have stopped out of respect for this moment of profound truth-telling. But my mother taught me something very important during those difficult years, James continued, his eyes never leaving Emily's face. She told me that hate is like a poison that grows stronger when we feed it with more hate. She said that the only way to stop the cycle of prejudice and pain is to choose a different path, even when others have hurt us deeply. James paused for a moment, allowing his words to sink in throughout the courtroom. He could see that people were hanging on every word, many of them thinking about their own experiences with prejudice and discrimination, either as victims or as people who had made similar mistakes to Emily's. Today, standing here in this courtroom that represents justice and fairness for all people, I choose not to feed that hate. James said with quiet dignity, I choose to respond to your cruelty with understanding. Not because you deserve it, but because that is who I choose to be. James looked directly at Emily with eyes that held no trace of anger or desire for revenge. Instead, his gaze was filled with a deep sadness, not just for his own pain, but for the pain that prejudice caused to everyone it touched, including those who carried it in their hearts. You will certainly face the consequences of your actions through the proper official channels, James said clearly, ensuring that everyone understood there would be accountability for what had happened. Your behavior today was unprofessional, discriminatory, and completely unacceptable in any workplace, especially in a court of law. Emily nodded through her tears, knowing that she deserved whatever punishment was coming her way. But I want you to understand something very important, James continued. The person you insulted and humiliated today is the same person who grew up poor in a council flat, who studied by candlelight when the electricity was turned off, who worked multiple jobs to pay for university, and who has spent his entire career fighting for justice and fairness for all people, regardless of their background or appearance. James's voice grew even gentler as he concluded his remarkable response to such cruel treatment. We are all human beings who deserve to be treated with basic respect and dignity. That is not something we have to earn. It is something we are, born deserving simply because we exist. Emily began to cry quietly, tears streaming down her face as she finally understood the terrible magnitude of what she had done. 3 months had passed since that cold Tuesday morning when everything changed in the Manchester Crown Court. The autumn leaves were falling outside the same tall windows, and the courtroom looked exactly the same as it always had. The wooden benches still sat in neat rows, the judge's bench still stood elevated at the front, and the same marble floors still echoed with footsteps. But for Emily Clark, everything in the world had transformed completely. She stood once again in the familiar courtroom, but this time she wore simple civilian clothes instead of her police uniform. The investigation into her behavior had been swift and thorough. The court system took discrimination very seriously, and there was no question about what had happened that day. Multiple witnesses had seen her treat Judge Thompson with shocking disrespect and prejudice. Her 8 years of police service had ended with a formal dismissal and a permanent mark on her record that would follow her forever. At first, Emily had felt only anger and self-pity. She blamed everyone except herself for what had happened. She complained to anyone who would listen that she was being treated unfairly, that she had just been doing her job, that people were being too sensitive about everything. For weeks, she sat in her small apartment feeling sorry for herself and growing more bitter with each passing day. But something unexpected had happened during those dark weeks of unemployment and shame. Judge James Thompson had done something that nobody, including Emily herself, could have predicted. Instead of simply allowing the system to destroy her career and forget about her completely, he had reached out through official channels with an offer that changed everything. James had suggested that Emily might benefit from working with community programs that helped young people from different backgrounds understand and respect each other. He had not demanded this as punishment, but had offered it as an opportunity for growth and healing. He believed that people could change if they were given the right chance and the proper guidance. The suggestion had come through Emily's lawyer, who was amazed that the judge would show such mercy to someone who had treated him so poorly. At first, Emily had rejected the idea completely. She was too proud and too hurt to accept what she saw as charity from the man she had humiliated. But as the weeks passed and her savings account grew smaller, she began to think more seriously about the offer. Emily now spent her days at the King Standing Community Center in Birmingham, the same neighborhood where James had grown up as a poor boy studying by candlelight. The building was old but well-maintained, with bright paintings on the walls and the sound of children's laughter echoing through the hallways. The center served families from every background imaginable: recent immigrants from Somalia and Pakistan, single mothers struggling to make ends meet, elderly people who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, and children whose parents worked multiple jobs just to pay rent every morning. Emily arrived at the center before 8 o'clock to help prepare breakfast for children whose families could not afford to feed them properly before school. She would smile and chat with kids who spoke different languages and came from cultures she had never bothered to learn about before. Slowly, very slowly, she began to see these children not as threats or problems, but as individual human beings with hopes, dreams, fears, and talents just like any other children. The work was harder than police duty in many ways, but it was also more rewarding than anything Emily had ever done. She discovered that she had a natural gift for connecting with young people who had experienced rejection and discrimination. Perhaps it was because she now understood what it felt like to be judged unfairly and to face the consequences of terrible choices. On this particular afternoon, Emily was sitting in the center's small library reading to a group of children aged 5 to 8. The books were worn and some had torn pages, but the children listened with wide eyes and bright smiles as she read stories about friendship, courage, and kindness. The diversity of the group would have made her uncomfortable just a few months ago, but now she cherished these moments. Miss Emily said the little girl named Grace, whose parents had moved to Birmingham from Jamaica 3 years earlier. Grace had beautiful braided hair decorated with colorful beads, and her smile could light up the darkest room. "Will you read us another story?" Emily looked down at Grace and felt her heart fill with genuine warmth and affection. This was not the fake smile she had once worn as part of her police officer persona, but a real expression of joy that came from a heart that had been fundamentally changed by experience and reflection. "Of course, love," Emily said, using the gentle term of endearment that had become natural to her over these months of working with children. "What story would you like to hear today?" Grace thought for a moment, her small finger tapping against her lip as she considered the options. "Can you read the one about the little girl who makes friends with everyone, even the people who are different from her?" Emily's eyes filled with tears, but they were good tears this time. She understood that Grace was not just asking for a story. She was describing the transformation that had happened in Emily's own life. At the end of each day, when the center grew quiet and Emily was cleaning up toys and books, she would think about Judge James Thompson. She had written him several letters over the past months, trying to find words adequate to express her gratitude and her deep regret for her past behavior. He had shown her that real justice was not about destroying people who make mistakes, but about helping them become better versions of themselves. Meanwhile, James continued his important work as a judge, treating every person who came before his bench with the same dignity and respect, regardless of their race, background, economic status, or the crimes they were accused of committing on his desk. He kept a small framed photograph of his mother, Mary, taken on the day she graduated from a night school program she had attended while working 3 jobs. The picture reminded him every day that kindness and understanding were always stronger than hate and prejudice. The courtroom where everything had begun slowly became known throughout Manchester as a place where justice was served with both wisdom and mercy. Lawyers began to speak respectfully of Judge Thompson's fairness and compassion. People who appeared before his court, even those who were found guilty of crimes, often left feeling that they had been treated with dignity and given hope for a better future. And sometimes, late at night when James was alone in his chambers, reviewing cases for the following day, he would pause in his work and smile. He knew that somewhere across the city, Emily Clark was reading bedtime stories to children who had learned to love and trust her. He knew that one heart had been changed forever, and that this change would ripple outward to touch many other lives in ways that could never be fully measured. The end.